think making assumptions is a risk. We don't know what we don't know. And that's what a feasibility study helps us find out, is the things that we don't know.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. Our mission is to help you raise more money so you can make the world a better place. Today's topic, Nonprofit Feasibility Studies. Many nonprofits operate within very tight budgets that leave little or no margin for error. That's why it's so important to make data-driven decisions whenever possible. In today's podcast episode, we'll look at one of the best sources of data that nonprofits can utilize before beginning a capital campaign or other large fundraising project, the Feasibility Study. Let's meet our panel.
Hi, I'm Rich Frazier. I'm the Senior Consultant for IPM Advancement.
Hi, I'm Sondra Madison. I'm a consultant with IPM Advancement.
Hi, I'm Alan Knobloch. I'm also a consultant with IPM Advancement.
And I'm Curtis Schmidt, your host and moderator today. Thank you all for joining me to talk about nonprofit feasibility studies. I'd like to start this conversation by reviewing some of the basics, just to make sure all of our listeners are up to speed. So let's begin by defining what a feasibility study is, and then on top of that, why is it important for nonprofits to do them and to do them well?
Different industries are going to have a different definition for a feasibility study. In our context, when we talk about a feasibility study, we're typically talking about the beginning of a capital campaign. And we are testing the validity of a capital campaign. We're testing the story or the case for support for a capital campaign. And we're trying to find the right donors for a capital campaign in its simplest, most basic definition.
Sondra, Alan, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add to that just the thought that it's not always a capital campaign. Organizations do campaigns and projects, and a study can be done for a lot of purposes. Primarily, it's for a capital campaign. And I agree with Rich. It's really to kind of discover some of the aspects that you need to have in place, and if they are in place in order to be successful.
And I would build upon Alan's comment to add that it is a point of reference of which you can look back during the campaign. If you are a year into it or 2 years into it, it's such a data-based process that it will give you context if there's questions that should arise.
I like that. So nonprofits should recognize that there's more value to a feasibility study than just answering, yes, we should proceed with this campaign, or no, we shouldn't. It also helps to provide context for decision-making during the campaign.
A lot of times an organization has already made up its mind that it's going to do a campaign, whether it's a capital campaign or some other sort of fundraising campaign. And then the feasibility study isn't so much about if or should we do a campaign. It's about how do we do this campaign and who should participate and where are they and how do we get them engaged. And so to Sondra's point, you get that kind of information in a feasibility study because you're talking to a lot of people and you're collecting a lot of data from those people. And yeah, you use that as a reference point throughout the engagement, throughout the campaign. From everything from who should be involved in the campaign to what your messaging looks like. Because a lot of times, a case for support is going to be drastically different during a campaign than what it started out looking like in a feasibility study.
Interesting. So what size nonprofits should do feasibility studies? And I guess what I'm really asking is, are they out of reach for any nonprofits? For example, should, say, a small local nonprofit invest time and money into doing a feasibility study?
Absolutely. Just because they're small doesn't mean they don't need to have that same critical information. It might even be more important, albeit those are the ones that they don't usually have the budgets of larger organizations, but they still need to get some form of that feedback, where the leadership gift's going to come from. And if they're not there, is this really even viable? Is a question that every organization needs to have an answer to, because you don't want to go down the path and have a failure. That's worse than anything.
I'd love to give listeners an example or two from your experience. Can you describe a real-world example of how you used a feasibility study to help a client's campaign? Sondra.
Sure. I can give you an example of an organization I worked with that had multiple sites. They were a human services organization, and they had closed a site 6 months to a year before they began the feasibility study, and was not aware until the feasibility study was complete, or we were about 2/3 of the way through, what a negative impact that had on the brand of the organization. So they had to take time before they went out to raise any dollars for this new project to really address the impact in that community, but also their image overall about closing down this site, why they did it, why they had to do it. And that was actually a good thing. It was a good investment because the services that were offered there were moved into another facility. So it wasn't a bad thing at all, but the news wasn't out.
Rich?
We did a feasibility study for an organization that before we actually got to the study, we had to help them beef up their development program somewhat. And they needed to do some work on developing their initiative that they wanted to do a campaign for. Once both of those aspects were solidly in position, we conducted a feasibility study to see if there was support out there in the universe for this new initiative. And like Sondra's example, this was an organization that had sites across the state. And what we found out was that there was a lot of support out there for this initiative and a lot of support by high-level donors, but there wasn't the infrastructure needed inside the organization. There wasn't that spirit of philanthropy, and there wasn't any of the low or mid-level support because most of the development work, most of the fundraising took place in the town that the headquarters was based in, as opposed to all these outlying communities. So that was a very informative feasibility study for all of us. And we came back and said, look, there is a lot of support for this initiative, but you're not ready for a capital campaign. This is not a right time for a capital campaign. A capital campaign creates a lot of work for a lot of people. So why don't we not go through a capital campaign? Why don't we just do a targeted fundraising effort towards those people and those industries who are very interested in your initiative? You're moving forward with that regardless. So let's go get that money from those folks and let's bring them into our circle. So it just kind of revamped and revised what we had in mind.
That's interesting. The feasibility study helped you determine that the initiative was the right initiative, but the capital campaign was the wrong fundraising strategy for that initiative. So if a feasibility study is so helpful, why might a nonprofit think, hey, we don't need to do a study, or feasibility studies work for other organizations, but they wouldn't work for us?
A lot of organizations don't realize that they don't know what they don't know. They think, oh, heck, this is a great project. We're doing great work. We've got great donors. Why do we need to waste our time and money on this study? And one of the things that we didn't mention earlier, but I think is crucial, is the whole confidential nature of the interviews that you do as part of a study. And I'll take a step back to the prior question and say I've recently had a study with a client where everything was positive, except there was a very, very dispersed positive and very negative feedback on the executive director, which is a situation that would have needed to been danced through very carefully with both volunteers and donors. So really the confidential nature of the interviews is something that the charity they can't get it themselves, and it's critical to moving forward with a campaign.
So that's an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up. The information the study elicits can be different depending on whether or not the nonprofit conducts the study themselves. So what would you say to a nonprofit that's thinking of running a feasibility study themselves instead of bringing in an outside consultant to help?
I'll piggyback off of what Alan just said. The folks that are going to participate in a feasibility study will tell a consultant something that they won't tell you as a staff member. And that information is going to be pretty valuable in the end result of the study.
I would also say that consultants, we see a lot of different organizations in the studies that we do and in our work. And so we can ask questions that really get to the best information back to them as a result of, experience doing these sorts of things.
I'm going to take a little bit of a different vein and talk about time. A nonprofit has its day-to-day work to fulfill its mission. And when they choose to move forward on a campaign, capital campaign, endowment campaign, comprehensive campaign, no matter what you call it, it is a lot of work, a lot of intense work over a period of time, including the feasibility study. So normally feasibility studies can take from, on average, start to finish, say 3 to 4 months to 6 months, depending, and added more time in for case development. And a lot of work of making sure you're picking the right people to speak to, of the case is ready, of you're asking the right questions. And all of that, to me, comes into the reason why outside counsel is so important, because you're starting the very beginning of the process with another set of eyes on it. And you tend to stay away from internal speak or internal jargon or thinking that you are the best organization in the world, which is what is then portrayed to people who answer the questions, where someone comes in from a neutral point of view and you get better information. And to follow up on what Alan and Rich shared, it's confidential, and what gets shared is a little bit more robust.
And I think that's a really good point, Sondra. That objective third party, there are a lot of organizations who use sort of their internal speak, right? And we are working with one now, and they're a great organization. But sometimes we have to pull them out of that internal jargon and say, okay, so that's a great way of saying that, but let's rephrase that so that the general audience can understand what you're saying. Part of our job is speaking truth to power, and it takes that objective third party to be able to do that. And very often, the consultants who are conducting a feasibility study are going to go on and consult on the campaign as well. And so this is really the beginning of our relationship with that organization, and getting to know them and getting to work with them from the very first steps of a campaign, so that we try to minimize all of the missteps that can happen in a campaign. Because if you start taking missteps very early on, they can just grow upon themselves later on in the campaign.
Really critical is finding leadership level gifts. And that's really a point that is emphasized in the study. And if they're not present, it would create a real bottleneck in conducting a campaign. So, that's definitely a factor as well.
Alan, I'll jump in with the importance of leadership overall. And not just leadership gifts, but a leader of the campaign, of someone who is the face of the campaign in the community. And many times without a feasibility study, it becomes the board chair, or it becomes the head of the resource development committee of the organization. And they already have a job. Their job is to either run the resource development committee or to run the organization as board chair, where a chair of the campaign can be that person, can be that leader and face of this effort, this marvelous effort in the community or the state or the country, or however large the campaign is or small the campaign is.
So just to tie this together for the listener, it sounds like what you're saying is that outside perspective can help identify some possibilities for who should lead the campaign that the organization members themselves may not readily see. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Correct. As well as feeding back to them, those people, they may also not be appropriate or have the leverage ability with their reputation and their experience to do a campaign. So definitely they may be right, but they may not. And that's why we want to look for that.
I want to ask some more questions about the role of a consultant, but before I do that, there's still some basics that I want to cover for the listeners. You've already touched on some of the risks of not doing a feasibility study, but what are some others? What are some other risks that a nonprofit might face by not doing a feasibility study?
Not raising enough money.
So setting your sights too low, that's a risk.
Where I've seen organizations struggle is going in and saying we need $2 million to do X or $5 million to do X. We're going to go in and we know who we can raise that money from, but not leveraging the energy of the effort that's in the community to possibly raise 7 million or 9 million or 10 million beyond that, because those individuals who might have been interested in contributing or supporting were not contacted.
Yeah.
Alan?
For me, the biggest one is, if you have a goal, generally you want a 20 to 25% lead gift. If that gift is not there, that has tremendous impact on the total number that they can raise. And organizations that want to push on without really knowing whether they have that in place or not, they do that at their own peril.
Can you say more about that?
If you need $1 million gift to make a $4 million goal, and you only have a $500,000 gift, the $500,000 falls into the below categories that create many, many more solicitations and many, many more prospects and much more difficulty, much more legwork, and much less likelihood of reaching your goal.
Rich, anything you want to add?
I think making assumptions is a risk. We don't know what we don't know. And that's what a feasibility study helps us find out, is the things that we don't know.
Right.
And if you make assumptions and think that you have all the answers, well, chances are you probably don't.
Timing is another big factor where you might think, okay, we've got these folks who support us. We know they're on board. And then you launch forward and you ask them for gifts like, well, we're in the middle of a big, pledge paying off another organization, so we can't really go there right now. It's sort of like a, whoa, that's, you just don't know what's going on in people's lives until you ask them in that confidential format.
Hi, this is Curtis from IPM Advancement jumping in for a moment. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your fundraising, membership, or advocacy program, or maybe you're considering a capital campaign and wondering if a feasibility study is right for you, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode. Let's now get into some of the finer details of a feasibility study. What are some of the key steps in a feasibility study that you don't want to skip over?
Initially, you want to get the right people with the organization involved, not just insiders, but try to get a blend of, if you can, some of their better donors to be part of the committee, the task force, whatever you want to call it, the group that's going to implement and oversee the study. Those are the folks, that you want to, and not a big number, but a few. You definitely want to have some volunteers. You definitely want to have the leadership staff. And those are the ones who are going to then get together and help you to craft their case, which people are going to react to, help you develop the list, which is going to be the people you go out to, and help you implement the study. But I'll kick it over to my colleagues.
That's a very important step, and that group of people is kind of going to give you guidance through the whole process. Concurrent to that is the development of the preliminary case for support. So this is the story that we tell. Why do we want to raise money? Why do we want to get money from you for this project? What are the needs out there in the universe in our community that this organization is meeting? And so that's an important step. And that, as Sondra alluded to earlier, can take a minute to do, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to make sure that we have time to do that we develop the right story, that we fine tune it. This is not going to be the final case for support. This is what we're testing. So we'll take this out into those confidential interviews and we'll share that story with the people who are being interviewed. And we'll come back with recommendations for improving that case for support.
The organization wants anyone either on the board or on the executive team says campaign, or should we do a campaign? There has to be a moment when the organization and its leadership sits down to say, are we ready for this? Is this the right time for us to do this? Are we staffed appropriately? Is this part of our overall plan? Is there someone else in the community that we should be working with? I mean, there's some key questions that even before the case is developed, that is really the readiness of the organization. And so that if you have a skeleton development department, and now you've done a feasibility study and it's a go and everyone's excited about it, and you realize you don't have the bodies in place to then move forward, let alone do your day-to-day fundraising, but then take on a campaign, it's not a good thing. Let me just say that in terms of the future success. And especially to follow up on what Alan said earlier, in smaller organizations.
That's an excellent point. So including an assessment in the front end of a feasibility study, a development assessment of their program. And so can I just throw this out there, and Alan and Sondra will back me up on this, but if there is now the sort of the scheduling of the interviews, which invariably is going to take the longest part of this whole process, right? So different consultants have different preferences. My preference is for the organization to schedule those interviews. I think that the supporters who are going to participate in an interview are more likely to respond to board members and executive leadership than they will to some guy or woman that they don't know. And there are different schools of thought. That's just my school of thought. But, if we can't get the interviews scheduled in a timely manner, that's another part of the assessment. All right. Do we have the relationships, and do we have the talent in the department to make sure these interviews happen?
100% agree with Rich.
So you want the consultant to conduct the interview, but the organization itself should be setting up the interviews because they already have the relationship with those people.
Absolutely.
I think Alan might have a different opinion here.
I don't have a different opinion. I think you start with that as the ideal model, but I've been worked down to a number of different ways, all the way to the bottom of that model where they haven't had the bandwidth or much ability to set those up, to hybrid where they'll send out an email from the executive director and lay the groundwork, and we'll follow up with that to schedule it. Nowadays with all the different communication vehicles, it's a lot easier for that to be more decentralized than it used to be. And the other piece of that is, where do you do those interviews? We always prefer to do it in person where they're at, because you can get a lot of nonverbal stuff from that. And then you back away to nowadays where a lot of it is on Zoom. But the best is the client sends out and schedules all your interviews in person, and they
all come to you, and you're sitting in the client's office. That's the ideal world.
That's the home run, because it doesn't cost you much either.
Alan, you mentioned conducting interviews over Zoom, and I'm curious how COVID-19 maybe affected feasibility studies. Is it possible to do an effective feasibility study virtually?
I would say absolutely yes. I may have said no to that before, but having done a couple studies and having done many Zoom interviews, I was pleasantly surprised that the engagement was still fairly high.
And I think clients realize that they don't have to pay for as much travel now. So it's cheaper for the client. And that's always a good thing.
It may change how feasibility studies are done moving forward.
It might. I think we all still prefer the face-to-face, because there is a lot of that human touch that you can't get on Zoom.
And like I said, the nonverbal, when you're with people and you can get a sense of their surroundings and their capacity, that's very helpful as well, because a lot of nonprofits haven't had that opportunity to sit with folks.
In your experience, where have you seen feasibility studies break down? So how can they go wrong? If whether it's the organization or the consultant, what kinds of mistakes or pitfalls can be made that would undermine the effectiveness of a feasibility study?
One of the most troublesome I've seen is when it's not the right interviewees, where those the people that are chosen to participate in the interview process are not really the ones that should be interviewed. And for a feasibility study consultant, you get about a third of the way through and you realize that all the answers are the same. Or that you're not getting, and you should be getting, some disparate information, or somebody asking some question or wanting more information, or having some critical content in there. But when everyone that you're speaking to, and you're a third of the way or 50% through with the interviews, and everyone says, yes, it's a great idea. Yes, they can do it. there's got to be some dissension in there at some point that you can really feel like there's validity behind what you're doing and asking the questions.
Interesting.
If everyone is a friend or everyone is a raving fan of the organization, or go back to something that Rich said, if the case is not robust enough or the case is not detailed enough, and in talking about the case with the interviewee, it may be that you're not hitting the right chords in the case as well.
Rich, Alan?
I would add sometimes they struggle. If you struggle to actually attain appointments with people, then you know they're not as cultivated as they need to be to the organization. And that's kind of a bit of a warning sign that they don't have the relationships that they need in order to be successful.
I think some organizations might jump the gun on a feasibility study, thinking that they're ready for a capital campaign, and they're not. And it gets a little bit awkward at some point when it becomes very apparent that they're not ready for a capital campaign.
Interesting. So back to this idea that consultants can offer a perspective that the organization doesn't really have on its own. I'm curious, if a nonprofit wanted to hire an agency or a consultant to do their feasibility study, what should they look for? Like, can we give the listeners some guidance on how to select a consultant or an agency who will do a really good job for them?
There are elements of a campaign feasibility study that are key. And if a consultant is not speaking to those elements when they are first speaking with the organization, so they're not talking about a strong case, they're not talking about a good interview selection, they're not talking about really testing or having a conversation with the organization about the number that should be tested, how much should be raised, and that that number can change. If they're not talking about campaign leadership, or if they're not talking about getting additional names that should be added to the feasibility study interview list as these interviews are conducted, and those are just some key elements that any good feasibility study consultant is going to be able to have a discussion with the organization.
Yeah, I would add to that, a lot of consultants can do this work. It's fairly structured and set in how it's implemented. But experience is crucial. Getting the most out of interviews is an art form to listen, or to ask questions and lead the conversation, but also to listen and record important information, details that are critical to keep, someone who is a one-word answerer. These can be very exhausting to really, really get the best out of. So experience is important, and I think fit. If you are comfortable with the consultant and they understand, what you're doing, I think experience in your line in their line of work is good. But I wouldn't say it's entirely necessary because, again, you want those independent eyes.
I agree with all the things that Sondra and Alan just suggested. And I think also, if I'm an organization hiring a feasibility study consultant, I'm going to be looking for value add. So organizations invest a lot of time and money in feasibility studies. What am I going to get out of it? So what's that end report look like? Am I going to get candid feedback from the interview participants? Am I going to get your observations as a consultant and your interpretations? Are you going to put that into context for me? Do you understand my organization and my case well enough to put that into context? Will you make recommendations for next steps? Will you guide me? Will you explain what those next steps mean? So that sort of report should always be additive to the organization. It should provide some value to the organization. And even if the report says you're not ready for a campaign yet, there should still be a value add. Like my example earlier with the organization that wasn't ready for a campaign, but we brought them back some big donors that they're now cultivating and pursuing.
Excellent. Now, before I ask my next question, I just want to tell the listeners, full disclosure, that IPM is an agency that does feasibility studies for our clients. And while we are suggesting that bringing in an outside consultant is the smart move, I would also like to provide some advice for nonprofits who are not able to do that for whatever reason. So if a nonprofit was going to do a feasibility study themselves, What advice would you give them so that they can really get the most out of it?
I would say plan accordingly. If you are not bringing someone in, and the other piece of having a consultant is the consultant is your guide, and as the consultant is the person who is going to get you to that next step. Even though you may not want to go to the next step, they're going to push you to the next step because that's our job. And if that is not present, to have a plan that everyone is fully aware of with drop dead dates, that this has to be, interviews need to be scheduled by such and such date. The case has to be done by such and such date. It needs to be reviewed by so and so in order to move forward. Because if you lose momentum, you're going to lose momentum all the way through the campaign. And it is just a sign of things to come. At least that's what I've seen.
I'm going to go a different direction with the question, Curtis. I'm going to suggest that an organization that's not going to hire a feasibility study consultant probably isn't going to do a feasibility study. They're probably that very well-oiled development department with a very high-level development executive that is confident collectively that they can fulfill a campaign on their own. And they may very well be confident and able to pull off this campaign, and they may not need to do a feasibility study. If that's the case, then I would advise the leader of that organization to appoint somebody to be the devil's advocate, to be the challenger in the room, to challenge decisions, to challenge opinions without fear of reprisal. Somebody just to say, let's stop for a moment. Let's look at this from a different perspective. Have we thought about this? Rethink what you think you know, because that's what a consultant's going to do for you. And if you don't want to pay a consultant, then maybe pick somebody on your staff or maybe pick somebody on your board to be that role, to fulfill that role.
Great.
I would add to that, having been part of a $25 million campaign and a $44 million campaign in offices that had a very well-defined, well-oiled fundraising machine. Both of those conducted feasibility studies for those campaigns for the very reason that we outlined it before. So, those are organizations you think could completely handle this on their own, and yet they still had a study and hired counsel throughout the whole process.
When an organization doesn't bring in a consultant to do a feasibility study or run a campaign, I think that there is energy that is drawn away from the day-to-day fundraising. It becomes all-encompassing. Everyone's talking about that campaign. No one's talking about how we're going to, meet our operating budget at the end of the year, unless they're adding on dollars to gifts they're soliciting during the campaign. I think that's a risk.
Okay.
If we go back to when we were talking about a risk, and if there is anything, it is that opportunity to make sure you have someone on point, as Rich talked about, that devil's advocate in the campaign. It's also making sure you have someone whose eyes are on the day-to-day fundraising operations, and that they are not being lessened by a campaign.
Great. You've all given listeners so much great content today. I have one more question for you. So for my final question to the panel, I'd like to ask each of you, if there was one thing you wanted a listener to take away from this conversation today, to remember about the importance of feasibility studies and how to make the most out of them, what would that be? Sondra.
Test the right case. And what that means is make sure that you have enough details to be informative, but not so many details that you will get stuck if you have to change the case post-feasibility study, or be too general where those that you're talking to really don't understand the impact or don't understand the scope of what you are trying to accomplish, who you're trying to serve, what you're trying to change. So what is the delta? What's the change that you're trying to make?
Great. Alan?
I would say consider the study part of the campaign, not a would nice to have addition to a campaign. It's critical.
Yeah, good point. And Rich?
I'm going to piggyback on that. So the information that you get from this study, you'll be using that throughout the campaign. And sometimes you're going to get information that you weren't expecting, or maybe you don't want to hear it. Open your mind to that. It's okay. Doesn't mean that your campaign won't work. Doesn't mean that your case is bad. It just means that we have to rethink what we thought we knew.
Excellent. Well, that wraps up our conversation on nonprofit feasibility studies. Thanks to our panel, Rich Frazier, Sondra Madison, and Alan Knobloch for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members, we'll include that information in the show notes. If you like this episode, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app, and leave us a review. Reviews are one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.